Chapter 1. Mountjoy. Have you ever stopped to think what a powerful weapon a key is? It's only a simple fashioned piece of mechanism, yet it can mean open sesame to love, home, friendship, or it can shut out all of these. It can mean liberty or bondage. Its possession indicates individual responsibility and power. Its loss strikes at the root of personal freedom and imposes a necessity of dependence on others. Lose your latchkey, and a sense of loneliness is yours on the spot. Be deprived of your latchkey and you're in fierce revolt. A galling feeling of humiliation takes possession of you. The key is the symbol of the open door to all your desires. Magnify your latchkey by 5. Multiply the result by 12. Hang them all on a steel ring and then rattle them. And you will understand a little of my feelings when the heavy door of Mountjoy Jail clanged on Little Christmas Eve 1923, and I was a prisoner within its walls. The opening of Margaret Buckley's book, The Jangle of the Keys. Fáilte erasure cáride to Undercover Irish. In this show, we're going to slip behind the veil of official history, dig around in the cupboards of collective memory, and pull out something that some elements of the state would rather we left alone. Today we're going to start talking about one of Ireland's most beloved institutions, reeling in the years. To those of you that are familiar with reeling in the years, you know the drill. The music, the clips, the feeling that you're being wrapped in a kind of a blanket woven from nostalgia, from half-forgotten RTE news bulletins. Music matches the mood of every story, and we get a really good view of the year in question through a lens that's a couple of years long. It's almost like a national scrapbook, and it gets it right, at least most of the time. But sometimes when you're watching Reeling in the Years, something mightn't fit quite right. Occasionally, it's completely wrong. Let me give you an example. The year is 1993. A big year. Alan McLaughlin's equaliser on the poisonous night in Windsor Park. Niamh Kavanagh with In Your Eyes winning the Eurovision. The Awkward Boys' own debut on The Late Late. And Mary McAleese visiting West Belfast. Sandwiched in the middle of that, there's the news story. Mary Harney, elected as leader of the Progressive Democrats, the PDs. But underneath the clip, the subtitle reads, quote, Mary Harney is the first woman to lead a political party in Ireland. But here's the thing, that's completely wrong. Not just technically wrong, spectacularly wrong. Because the first woman to lead an Irish political party was Margaret Buckley, and she was elected to that role way back in 1937. And so, Corda, we ask ourselves a deceptively simple question. How did such a trusted programme get something so basic, so completely wrong? And the answer, as we're about to see, reveals something much bigger, much greater about the Ireland we inherited. In today's programme of Cordia, we're going to look at the democratic programme of 1919. We're going to use it as a lens to look at the version or the vision of Ireland that could have been. We're going to show how Margaret Buckley embodies that radical promise. We're going to explore her life. And we're going to ask the question, why was she written out of history? And crucially, why is she still on the margins of Irish history? Accordia, fáilte, and you're very welcome to Undercover Irish, the podcast about Ireland's hidden curriculum. The lessons that were always there, hidden in plain sight. You'll find them in the ballads we sing, the place names we pass, the poems we half remember, and the Irish words we still use without thinking. It's the history that sat at the edges of our textbooks, but lies at the centre of our story, the kind that explains who we are and how we got here. It's Misha Olin, and I love uncovering the meanings behind Ireland's language, lore, and I love to bring you history, linguistics, culture, and bring it together through a story. Each episode reveals how Ireland's real education has been happening all along, in songs, sayings, small moments of everyday life. This podcast is for anyone who's ever felt there was more to Ireland than the version they were taught. For the curious learner who wants to make new connections. For the nostalgic soul who wishes they'd learned these lessons in school. And for the lovers of story and song who know that Ireland's history lives best when it's spoken aloud. After all, we are an oral culture. So wherever you are in the world, be a géisteacht, have a listen, sit back, settle into the sound. Whether you're at home or part of the great Irish story abroad, Undercover Irish invites you to rediscover and uncover the Ireland that's been with us all along, in words, our memories, and our music. The Cárja, Araigling, Le Céile. Cárja, the first thing we need to talk about or focus on before we go any further is a word, historiography. So we know what history means. Let's look at historiography. It's not just a fancy academic word. It's about how we write history. Not simply what happened, but how we choose to frame it. It's the art of deciding who gets remembered and who gets erased, and which moments get stitched together to form the official story of a nation. It's about omission just as much as addition. What gets left out quietly shapes our understanding just as powerfully as what gets left in. Sometimes whole communities disappear from the record, not because they weren't there, but because their presence complicates the kind of tidy arc of the national memory. And sometimes small events are blown up into defining moments, not because they're universally experienced, but because they suit the narrative of those who get to hold the pen. Think of that word historiography like a magnifying glass. Those in power get to decide where that magnifying glass is placed, where it lands, which stories are zoomed in on, illuminated, made iconic, and which ones are left as a blur in the background, directs the eye. That's why something like Reeling in the Years feels authoritative, and in the example we opened the podcast with, can be very, very misleading. Because if we reflect on what we might term accepted history or official history, it's the product of time, it's the product of its creators, it's a product of a broader cultural mood. It highlights what fits the national narrative. And when I say national narrative, I mean those in power. It quietly sidesteps people and struggles that don't fit that image. And that's why understanding historiography matters. If we don't understand that, we don't understand or question who chose the angle, who chose this, who got cropped out of the picture, what perspective is missing, and we risk losing a massive part of what ought to be part of our national conscience and our history. Now that we have understood what historiography is and we're kind of taking on official history here, we're asking the question, why was Margaret Buckley erased from history? And to answer that question, first of all, in my opinion, we need to go back to a document from 1919. It's the Democratic Programme of the First Dáil. Now, many people with a passing interest in Irish history will be more than familiar with the proclamation of the Irish Republic in 1916. As a document, it stands among world's documents as one of the most famous and important documents in world history. Sometimes we undersell our own history, but that document ranks right up there, both in terms of its content, its deliverance, and its importance, obviously to Ireland, but to world affairs. Remember, they were taking on the British Empire. But the democratic programme is not as well remembered, understood, or known. And I can't help but feel that this is kind of deliberate, and I'll get to why now. The Democratic Programme of 1919 was the first document passed by the First Dáil Éireann. This was the group of TDs, Teachtaí Dáile, that were elected in 1918 but chose not to take their seats in Westminster's Parliament, but instead to set up the Irish Republic, a government of the Irish Republic. And this document was the first bit of business that they passed. And what the document did was it put meat on the bones, it put flesh on the bones of what was promised in 1916. Because while it was very overt in 1916 what was intended to happen, a separatist republic, equality for all people, the Democratic Programme went further. It described the vision of Ireland, the functioning of Ireland, how Ireland would be, the ideals of the revolution. It doubled down on some of the promises of 1916, declaring the nation's sovereignty extended not only to all men and women of the nation, but all its material possessions, the nation's soil, its resources, all of its wealth and all of its wealth-producing processes. This is an extremely radical promise. Again, we have the repeating of men and women, as it was done in 1916, as equals, one of the first documents in the world to do that, but it states openly that the sovereignty extends to all of the resources within the nation. There's a line in the document that says, "We reaffirm that all right to private property must be subordinated to the public right and welfare." Now, this is an extremely radical idea. You think about it. What it's saying there is going completely against the previous British legal system where private property, is sacrosanct, where the right to private property gives landlords and other people the ability to extract, the ability to control all of the resources. But this document states that that right has to be subordinated to the public good and the public welfare. In other words, the public welfare is more important than the right to private property. It says that every citizen shall have the opportunity to spend his or her strength and faculties in the service of the people. And in return for willing service, we, in the name of the Republic, declare the right of every citizen to an adequate share of the produce of the nation's labour. Again, talk about radicalism. The share given to every citizen of the nation's labour. And it states, and this is a really important thing to reflect on in today's day, on Law Atá Onnanumh, the day that's there today. The quote is, "It shall be the first duty of the government of the Republic to make provision for the physical, mental, and spiritual well-being of the children, to secure that no child shall suffer hunger or cold or from lack of food, clothing, and shelter." Now, this was the very first promise made by the Republic in 1919. It's unbelievably progressive in its promise. And what I'm struck by is the mention of the mental well-being, not just the spiritual well-being, not just the physical well-being, but the mental well-being of the children of the nation. And it explicitly says around food, clothing, and shelter, this should be the first aim of the Republic. And it doesn't stop there. The Democratic Programme pushes even further. It condemns what it calls, quote, "the present odious, degrading, and foreign poor law system," and promises instead a native, humane approach to social welfare, one that treats the nation's elderly and infirm not as a burden, but as citizens deserving of gratitude and care. And you have to remember, this generation is only 2 generations removed from An Gorta Mór, the Great Hunger. Among the revolutionaries, there's a deep generational hatred for what they saw as cruel and inhumane British system that punished people for falling into poverty. So here in black and white is a promise to undo that system. And then comes the bold declaration. "We desire our country to be ruled in accordance with the principles of, quote, liberty, equality, and justice for all, This is pure republicanism, right at the heart of the document. And the programme does not stop at political and social ideals. It speaks directly to workers and trade unionists demanding, quote, social and industrial legislation that will permanently improve the lives of the working classes, end quote. No matter how many times I read it, the radicalism of the 1919 Democratic programme hits me. The social ideas in it are extraordinary, revolutionary really, and yet it's nowhere near as famous as the 1916 proclamation. And I can't help wondering if that was deliberate. Because the very first act of Dáil Éireann, the very first act of this new breakaway Irish government in 1919 was to adopt a programme that subordinated private property to the public good, that demanded workers' rights and placed care for the vulnerable at the centre of national life. Accordia, when you read it, it's hard not to notice that this document is not only vital to our history and understanding our history, but it's also extremely relevant today, san lá atá ann inmh. Is tóca, go bhfuil sé níos tábhachtaí inmh ná riamh. I think it's more important now than ever, not least because many of the promises declared in 1919 were never delivered upon. And this brings us back to Margaret Buckley. She wasn't just a Republican. She was a labour activist, a campaigner. She stood up for workers, particularly women, and especially domestic workers, through her involvement with the Irish Women's Workers' Union. She believed in the democratic programme's principles because she lived them. But as radical as the programme was, it needed a government capable of implementing it. And in the middle of the Tan War, that's exactly what the Irish Republic tried to do and tried to build, a functioning counter-state. This was a government with the loyalty of local councils, with the loyalty of the majority of the people, and at times even its own police force. And crucially, it tried to develop its own legal system. These were the Dáil courts. The Dáil courts were established specifically to replace the British legal system, and their guiding principles, the democratic programme of 1919. Just think about how audacious this was. The government of the Irish Republic, still fighting for its survival, set up its own court system. And these courts ran. They operated locally. They removed the wig and gown, the symbol of the British justice system, and replaced them with something distinctly Irish and democratic. And hanging over it all was the radical promise from 1919 that the right to private property would be subordinated to the public welfare. Imagine what a threat that was, not just to the British administration, but to landlords and wealthy interests right across the country. And right in the middle of this legal revolution stands Margaret Buckley. She was appointed as a judge in the Dáil courts, one of the very people charged with giving life to the democratic programme and indeed the Republic. She wasn't just talking about republicanism. She wasn't just supporting labour rights, workers' rights. She embodied the revolution. By serving as a Dáil court judge, Buckley became part of the machinery that actively dismantled British rule in Ireland. She helped enforce Irish Republican law, guided by the principles we've discussed. As Dorothy McCardle later wrote in her book, The Irish Republic, which is kind of like a biography of that living republic, Austin Stack, the Minister for Justice, lost no time in building this Republican legal system. Judges were appointed, courts were created, a constitution and a set of rules were drafted with remarkable speed and clarity, and the structure was intentionally democratic. A Supreme Court, district courts, and parish courts. Justice from the bottom up to the top. Margaret Buckley was one of the people that made that real. And if the heroics of those who went and literally fought for the Republic on the battlefield are well known and extremely important to the creation and upholding of the Irish Republic, sometimes we can forget the role and the bravery of those in administration who served the Republic and literally built it from the ground up. But Accordia, As we know, it was not to last. Gav Malashkela Cordia, sorry to jump in for a quick moment. If you're enjoying Undercover Irish and you'd like to support the work that goes into making this podcast, please consider joining and supporting on Patreon. For a small fee, you'll help to keep the show going and help the stories like this come back into the conversation. And for patrons this week, a special treat. I've taken an original photo of Margaret Buckley, I've modernised it, and I've created a few modern pop art style versions to it, a way of bringing her image back into the present day. Patrons can feel free to download it, share it, print it, stick it on a wall. Whatever you like is Cumulum, it's yours to spread the image. Gurv Mila Mahago de Cordia for supporting the show. Now, back to the scale in this episode. So now that we've seen how radical the democratic programme really was, and how Margaret Buckley lived and embodied that revolutionary promise, we need to follow the thread of what happened next. Because the story of the Irish Republic is also the story of how it was smothered. Partition in 1921 and the Anglo-Irish Treaty changed everything. The Republic declared in 1919, that radical social democratic republic, is pushed aside in favour of a free state, partition and compromise in the shadow of the British Empire. And instead of realising the ideals of the programme, the new state shelves them. The Free State chose a conservative, penny-pinching austerity. And in terms of economics, they followed and copied and pursued the previous British administration's policy in Ireland. This is a government that protected property, cut public spending, and placed so-called stability above social change. All of the radical promises from 1919, the idea of workers' rights, of public welfare, of subordinating private property to the common good, are abandoned. The poor remain at the margins, workers are betrayed, and the country drifts into caution and conservatism. And nowhere do we see that clearer than restoration of the British legal system. Remember the Dáil courts, the revolutionary legal system Margaret Buckley helped to run. Courts without wigs, without the colonial symbolism, guided by principles of justice for the people. They are dismantled instantly. The Free State reimposes the British court structure, British procedures, British traditions, the very system the revolutionaries had rejected. And it's one of the clearest signs of what was a counter-revolution. But Margaret Buckley, she does not bend. She refuses to recognise the Free State, she holds on to the 1919 Republic, and she pays for it. She's arrested, imprisoned, and treated as an enemy of the new order. And yet, ironically, it's in prison that we get the clearest picture of her, because there she writes a book called The Jangle of the Keys, her memoir of prison life. It's sharp, it's witty, it's insightful, it's fiercely political, and it gives us a really good insight into the person that she is. In trying to silence her, ironically, the Free State preserved her. Before we move to the 1930s and the next great contest over the meaning of the Republic, I want to pause, because this is the moment when history gets a little bit tricky, and there's a real danger of reading history backwards, as Donald Fallon warns on his podcast. We often looked at the mid-20th century Ireland, conservative, cautious, devoutly Catholic, and assume that this was the inevitable direction of the revolution, that the radicalism of 1919 was an illusion, that nobody ever seriously intended to create a socially just republic. And that interpretation comes from somewhere. One of the most repeated lines, one that shaped a whole generation of official history, came from Kevin O'Higgins, a key architect of the Free State. He famously called his government, quote, the most conservative-minded revolutionaries that ever put through a successful revolution, end quote. And that line, let's be honest, is self-serving and revisionist. It's not analysis, it's justification. It suggests that the revolution was always meant to be conservative, that the democratic programme was simply window dressing, and that the Free State was the natural fulfilment of 1916 rather than a retreat from it. And because winners write history, that line was repeated so often, it became truth. School textbooks accept it, newspapers accept it, official histories accept it. And with it came another distortion. Some of those same official histories give the impression that women simply disappear from Irish public life after the 1920s, as if they vanish when the state turns conservative, as if they willingly retreat into the home. But the truth is very different. The 1930s, the very decade often framed as the height of conservatism, is the decade when Ireland gets its first female leader of a political party, Margaret Buckley. And women were active in public life through groups like the Irish Women Workers' Union, which remained a force in labour rights, looking for equal pay and workplace justice. Women didn't disappear, they were erased from the narrative. And the Constitution of De Valera would help cement that erasure. Now into this landscape comes De Valera's 1937 Constitution. De Valera had risen to power in 1932. And at one stage, Buckley and De Valera would have been very much on the same side in the early revolutionary era and during An Cogadh Cathaoirleach, the Civil War. But Buckley was to be disappointed by De Valera as well. Margaret Buckley had no time for the 1937 Constitution. She believed the Constitution was a betrayal of the Republic, a narrowing of the vision rather than a widening of it. And she opposed it from two main perspectives. Firstly, she was Republican and anti-imperialist in her critique. In a letter from that time, she argued the following. And the letter read, "The Constitution does not end the evils of imperialism in Ireland, and like its predecessor of 1922, it is a negation of the Republican principles for which our bravest and best had given their lives. We reassert on behalf of the nation that Republican Ireland will not compromise the national position." And her statement was also signed by Tom Barry, Etna Coyle, Sheila Grennan and Diarmuid O'Riordan. And her second critique on the Constitution came from the point of view of women's rights, feminism and workers' rights. Herself and some other feminist groups and feminist activists pointed out that the Constitution might well curtail the role of women, not alone in public life, but in society. And yet here's the twist. In the very same year that she writes these critiques, the very same year that the Constitution is passed, the very same year that she hangs the flag at Kevin Barry House at half-mast in recognition of that, Margaret Buckley is elected Uachtaráin Sinn Féin, President of Sinn Féin, the first Irish woman to lead a political party, a woman opposing the most powerful political figures in the country, a woman challenging both the conservative nationalism and conservative Catholicism. She didn't fade away, she refused to. So by the end of the 1930s, we can explain part of the mystery. We know why Margaret Buckley was sidelined by the Free State. We now know why she clashed with De Valera's Ireland. And we can see how her radicalism, her commitment to 1916 and the 1919 Republic set her against the dominant politics of the time. But one question still hangs over everything. Why was Margaret Buckley still written out of Irish history by the time the 1990s arrived? Because if ever there was a moment when she should have been rediscovered or re-unveiled, a moment of social change, feminist scholarship, cultural liberalisation, all that was the late 80s and the 90s, she wasn't. She remained absent. To understand why, we need to now step out of the 1930s and into the late 20th century. We need to look at the forces shaping Irish memory in the modern era. The world of political silence, media control, and the shadow cast by the conflict in the north. We need to examine Section 31, the culture of censorship, and how the eruption of violence and political tension shaped who was allowed to speak and who was quietly removed from the national story. And we're going to take a broader look at how women fared in Irish society from the 1940s right through to the 80s and 90s. Decades of restriction, resistance, gradual change, to understand the environment in which someone like Margaret Buckley could so easily disappear from public memory. So join me on the next episode of Undercover Irish as we explore Margaret Buckley's life, women's place in Irish society, political censorship, Section 31, and how the conflict in the North reshaped the stories we were allowed to hear. I've really enjoyed this episode. If you've enjoyed this episode, please follow on Instagram, consider supporting on Patreon, but most importantly, Scop on Scale. Spread the story. Share the podcast with a friend, or simply tell the story of Margaret Buckley to a friend or colleagues, and keep that memory alive. I'm really looking forward to the next episode where we go to the next section of this particular story and build on it. And until then, thank you so much for being with me. Berigi bua agus slán go fóil.